The prologue to God liberating the Israelites includes intense negotiations between Pharaoh and Moses for the lives of the Hebrew people. They have been enslaved for 400 years with seemingly no hope of liberation. We hear in Exodus 3 that we covered last week that God finally hears their cry and sends them Moses, who grew up in the house of Pharaoh, along with his brother Aaron, who will be God's mouthpiece. They deliver God's message to Pharaoh, "Let my people go." Pharaoh relents, but the next day his heart is what? It is hardened, and Pharaoh refuses. Moses, God, and Pharaoh get into this cycle of escalation, of plagues and stubborn refusal. Moses demands, "Let my people go." Pharaoh's heart hardens, followed by refusal. And then there's another plague. On and on, it is relentless. 10 times this happens. Many of us memorize the 10 Commandments, but I will be really curious to find out how many of you memorize the 10 plagues. Water turning to blood, frogs, lice and flies, wild and sick animals, boils, thunderstorms of fire and hail, locusts, darkness for 3 days, and the death of firstborn children. If you were Pharaoh and your people, the Egyptians, were experiencing these pesky followed by deadly plagues, and you saw how your stubborn decisions led to such destruction and death to your people, you might reconsider and rethink your stubborn stance. But so often, people, especially people in power, can and do inflict their destructive, harmful decisions on others without remorse. The cost to empire and to power becomes more important than pesky plagues, especially if it has an economic impact on the bottom line, even if it ends up being harmful to oneself or those one loves, and it's harmful to one's integrity and character. There are so many memes about this particular year, 2020. It's almost like we are reliving the plagues that Exodus spells out from chapters 5 through 11. We have a literal plague in the coronavirus pandemic. It is devastating that we are closing in on 200,000 deaths from the virus in the United States alone. Many that scientists and health professionals feel could have been averted. What else feels like a plague this year in 2020? If you're up to it, feel free to start listing some of those plagues in the chat, and I may be able to call a few of them out without including your names. And I might be listing a few, and you may be echoing some of the ones that I'm calling out right now. Many are calling racial injustice a pandemic, one that has plagued people of color for over 400 years. Climate change might be another plague that humans have contributed to since the industrial age. I am hearing people say that this is one of the worst fire seasons on record, with the West Coast recording the worst air quality in the world. It feels like a plague when one of the only safe places we had to go besides our houses because of the pandemic was outside, and now that too is off limits, at least for a few days. Fossil fuels, hurricanes, rising temperatures, rising sea levels, derecos, earthquakes, all part of climate change. I'll head to chat, see if wildfires, fires, tornadoes, hurricanes, racism, partisanship, our national leadership, plague of dishonesty, mental illness and the lack of access to care, hate, police brutality against protesters, white hatred of people of color, lack of food for 1 in 4 Americans, plague of falsehoods, now called news, respect for the Constitution, arson as the cause of some of the fires, disrespect for law and order while demanding law and order from others, COVID-19, all lives matter, killing of so many trans women of color, ignorance. All right, you can continue to respond in the chat. I'm going to leave that. This year feels like a plague in many ways. I will continue with my list. The rise of fascism and undermining robust journalism by calling it fake news. Diminishing the role of science and truth by obfuscating or undermining of facts. The plague of uncertainty and ambiguity. Economic uncertainty. The uncertainty in August of what school was going to be like for our kids. The uncertainty of how we gather for church, for worship, and not knowing when we will ever get back to being able to worship with one another in person. Perhaps for some, the uncertainty of football. And what are some of you going to do without football? I'm already mourning the loss of women's basketball. The last few days, the sky has turned dark. The sun has turned red because of over 100 fires burning through the West Coast. It feels like there are parallels in this Exodus passage and from the passage of Joel chapter 2, where the prophet writes, I will show portents in the heaven above and signs on the earth below, blood and fire and smoky mist. The sun shall be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the Lord's glorious day. It sounds and it feels apocalyptic. It feels like the end days are coming. Krista Tippett, broadcaster for the podcast On Being, said these words on her podcast, end of May, beginning of June this year. The Greek word apocalypse does not mean the end of the world. What it means is an uncovering, the lifting of a veil, a revealing. The COVID-19 virus has uncovered all of the reckonings we must walk towards if we are to become wise and whole as individuals, communities, institutions. The questions of who we will be to each other has been surfacing more insistently, and its implications have now been laid bare in our economies, our politics, our cultures. Perhaps it is time for an uncovering, the lifting of the veil as this apocalypse descends. One of my clergy colleagues, Reverend Heather Riggs, down in Portland, posted these words a few days ago. In terms of apocalypse as revealing or uncovering, this year has revealed the holes in our social safety net, the injustices of our economic system. What if this isn't just a revealing moment? What if this is an Exodus moment where the earth cries out for justice and release? Well, God didn't cause all of this and isn't punishing anybody. God can speak to the hard-hearted about the importance of mercy. When we look back at Pharaoh's words and Pharaoh's actions, we have to wonder, Pharaoh, and that's all the name we have for this person, Pharaoh. We do not have a name. Did Pharaoh ever learn mercy? After that terrible night of death, the words he spoke to Moses, "Go, leave me in peace," do not align with his later actions. Because Pharaoh never just let them go. After the final deadly plague, his heart is hardened once again. He chases after them with all his military might, using his own law and order, words people in power employ to maintain control over those it seeks to oppress for its own gain. Liberation from oppression will always come at a cost to empire, where compassion and mercy are in short supply. After years of bondage to Egyptian masters, meaningless drudgery, freedom was within the grasp of the ancient Israelites. Scripture records at the end of chapter 13, when Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them by the way of the land of the Philistines, which was closer. For God thought, they may change their minds and return to Egypt. So God led the people by the roundabout way of the wilderness toward the Red Sea. God went in front of them in a pillar of cloud by day to lead them, and a pillar of fire by night to give them light, so that they might travel by day and by night. And then we hear in Exodus 14 that the people complained to Moses, and this will be a recurring theme, because even when you are set free or you're on the cusp of being set free and being liberated, you might look back and like, oh, things were better back then. I think I might as well go back to my old life. Exodus 14 tells us the people complained. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians in slavery than have you bring us out here to die in the wilderness. And then we hear the voice of Moses recorded in chapter 14. Do not be afraid. Stand firm. The Lord will fight for you. You have only to keep still. And then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. And I know that some of you are conjuring up Charlton Heston right now. Staff and the hands out over the sea. And then God parts the waters to provide a way forward for the Israelites. And then God causes the waters to return, killing the Egyptian pursuers. God smote them. The waters, they were drowned. Pharaoh's army got drowned. That was the song I sang growing up. And I have to ask a question of God. Is this divine partisanship? Does God support some people and destroy others without regret? While our heart of hearts might desire vindication and vengeance, it is difficult to reconcile a God who would continue the cycle of violence that Pharaoh began. That would be morally and theologically problematic. In the documentary that a few of you watched, The Prison Within, there was a woman whose husband was killed by a gang member. He was a police officer, and she called for the death penalty for him, and he is now on death row. He is still on death row. And in this documentary, the wife, the widow, she said, I wanted vengeance. I wanted vindication. I wanted his life. And then she realized that that desire brought her no peace. So how do we look at this scripture? Dr. Derek Weber, Director of Discipleship Ministries for the United Methodist Church, poses this question. What if a literal reading of this text is not the best way to read it? What if what needs to die are the closely held beliefs of white supremacy, of racial superiority, and religious bigotry? What if what needs to die is a worldview that wants to cling on to their racism as if it were their firstborn child? A racism that oppresses and dehumanizes. Those words from Dr. Derek Weber. When they reached the other side, Moses was so moved by what had happened that he burst into song. God has triumphed gloriously, and the horse and the rider thrown into the sea. And I learned the words of this ancient scripture when I was a kid too. Triumphing gloriously, that the horse and the rider, they were thrown into the sea. At the end of chapter 15 that Elizabeth read for us, we see that Miriam, the sister of Moses and Aaron, takes the tambourine, and all the women follow Miriam with tambourines in their hands and with dancing, and Miriam sings, "Sing to the Lord, for God has triumphed gloriously, the horse and the rider thrown into the sea." If we don't take this reading literally, where does God need to triumph today? And this is a serious question I'm posing because we are partners with God. We are companions of God. And so I invite you to turn back to the chat. And I probably won't pull these out during this message. But what are the desires of the people of United Church, of where God needs to triumph today? What plagues need to be thrown into the sea? And how do we, as people of faith, turn cycles of violence, Pharaoh's cycle of violence and retribution, to healing acts of forgiveness and restorative justice, which the documentary, The Prison Within, talks about. Way back in February, do you remember February? It was pre-pandemic. Do you remember what you were up to? A few of us, and I think you all are all here for worship this morning, and you will remember this day. You attended the Interfaith Advocacy Day with Faith Action Network in Olympia, the state's capital. Neil, you were there. Marilyn, Judy, Chris Berry, Robert. I'm probably forgetting somebody. My apologies. Way back before our lives were impacted by the pandemic, do you remember those who were there? And for those who weren't, I'm going to share with you Rabbi Seth Goldstein of Olympia. He talked about this story of crossing the Red Sea. That like the Israelites, we get so caught up in slogging through the mud, working for justice, that we aren't aware of miracles taking place around us all the time. Rabbi Goldstein spoke these words at United Churches of Olympia. The Israelites complained, in Egypt we had mud, in the sea we have mud. We can't be concerned with the mud on our feet. Rabbi Goldstein says, we need to be mindful of miracles. Look for the path ahead, not the mud below. Keep your hearts and your eyes open. When I see all of you gathered here together to do this work, I am buoyed by this work of educating ourselves about important issues, this work of connecting with neighbors to share strategy and inspiration, this work of telling our elected leaders that the world as it is not the world as it could be. It is a bit of a slog, but that doesn't make our arrival on the other side any less of a miracle. That is the miracle, that we can create the world God intends through hard work and persistence, that we have the power to build relationships and change minds, that we can advocate for solutions that bring about a more just world, that we can say that we must care for creation using the best science, that we can say no to private prisons, the death penalty, and discrimination, that we can say welcome to those who come to this country seeking refuge and opportunity, that we can say we need a more equitable economic foundation with a fair distribution of resources so that everyone has what they need: food, healthcare, a home. We can say this because we are a people rooted in our values and faith. Let's march through the mud to get through the promised land. These are the words of Rabbi Seth Goldstein way back in February of 2020. God is working within us toward the healing of the planet, a concept in Judaism called tikkun olam, literally the repair of the world, a way of acting constructively. The victory of God at the ancient Sea of Reeds is a foretaste of that victory, where God's desire is to make creation whole again in the face of our human proclivity to fragment it. Let us join the work as companions of God in this tikkun olam. May it be so. Amen. In the New Century Hymnal, there is a hymn called Glory, Glory, Hallelujah. It's on page 2. It's right at the beginning of the hymnal. It references the Exodus with words like, I feel so much better since I laid my burdens down. And then another verse is, I am dancing Miriam's dance now, since I laid my burdens down. The choir sang this anthem with slightly different words. We don't hear about Miriam in the anthem, but it's called Since I Laid My Burdens Down. And we have a raw recording of it. It gets a little jumpy at times. It was never meant to be used for a worship service like this in the midst of a pandemic. It just happens to be one of the pieces we have, and I'm so grateful. And the choir is missing a few voices, but the voices that are in this recording are mighty, and it features A.J. Milleret as a soloist. And we want to share this with you for our worship service today.